Mini-Concertina Book. Everybody calls me Kat. We're here in my studio today because I'm going to share with you the second part of my Mini-Concertina tutorial. And I'm going to show you the texturing and how I created the images for that. But first, I want to thank all of our new subscribers. We've had a lot of new subscribers lately. If you'd like to subscribe and you're watching this on YouTube, on the right-hand corner of your screen, just push the subscribe button. We'd love to hear your comments, and if you have any questions at all about the products or how to create this book today, I will be happy to get back to you as soon as possible. And if you like it, push like. Thank you. And we're going to show you how to make this right now. This is one of my Mini-Concertina books that I created for So Somerset, and I wanted to just kind of refresh your memory about what they looked like. I used a wash on this, and I'm going to show you how to do that. And then these are images that I created on tissue paper, so I'm going to show you that today too. But to get started, if you've seen the first tutorial, then you know that the way I began to do this was I started by cutting small cards, 3.5 inches, or 3 inches by 3.5 inches, or 3 by 3s, whatever you prefer to do. I've done it both ways. And this first step is to gesso it. So I cut the cards out, 4 cards, and then stitch them together. So there are 2 ways of creating this book. First of all, I'm going to show you, this is the gesso I used, and it is just a plain white gesso, and I gessoed both the front and back sides. So I just want a nice clean coat on here, and the kind of gesso that I use is dependent upon the piece that I'm creating. It usually directs what kind of color of gesso I'm going to use. So gesso is just a primer, and it's just going to give my sheet a nice connection with anything else I'm going to do. Now there are 2 ways of creating this, as I said before. The first way is to cut all the pieces and decorate them, and then stitch it together. And the other way is to stitch it all together and then decorate the book. So you have a choice. Now I've done it both ways. It just depends on how I feel at the time. So you're going to let this gesso card, your cards, dry. So I would gesso this side, and then I would do them all in a line, and then wait for them to dry, and then come back, flip them over, and do it again. So that's step 1. Step 2 is to collage your board. So this has already been gessoed. It has a real rough texture, and that's what you're wanting. You feel that primer on there. So I'm going to be using golden regular gel matte, and if you've been watching my videos, you know it's what I usually use in the studio. I like a matte surface. I don't like shiny things, unless of course it particularly calls for something shiny. And I generally use golden. I'm using Liquitex gesso in the studio because I couldn't find any golden product. We're going to fix that though. We're going to be able to get some here real soon. So the second step is to collage. And so I'm going to just layer this card with the gel medium. And this is one instance where you could use a gloss and it wouldn't matter because you wouldn't see it. So if you had it, that would be perfect. And then I used, to do this, to create these mini concertinas, I used old book pages from a French language book. And I wanted a real clean, really pretty kind of white kind of look, or just a slightly tinted gray color. So I wanted to be able to see all the way through the layers. My inspiration for this was to see through the garden, to see all the way to the back of the garden, right through all of the foliage and everything. That was what I was going for. So now I'm just going to take that book page, and I'm just going to lay it down on top of the card that I've cut. And when you're collaging these, it's great to get a really good connection. You may want to use a bone folder. I usually use my fingers, but I often use a bone folder as well. And there are 2 ways of doing this. You can leave it here to dry overnight, or you can rip it back. and see how much of it has transferred on there. I use both techniques, to be honest with you. I like them for different reasons. And today, the one that we're using, the one that I used for these for the books, is to just simply leave it overnight, let it dry, and then rip the page back. So I've used a whole sheet of paper, which I normally wouldn't do. I would have started here where the print was, but just to show you, just to give you an idea. So I'm going to rip that back, and this step is called decollage. Now you can do this step as many times as you want. One of the things you might want to pay attention to is that your words should all line up. So if you're going in one direction, you should keep that direction, unless you want it to look incoherent, which is the look I was going for in the book Conversations with My Mother. So that's step number 3. The next step is to paint. And on the Poetic book, which is a sunflower book, when you open it up, it says sunflowers. On this book, I used a combination of golden paints. I used Titan Buff and I used titanium white. I almost never use this paint straight out of the tube. I always mix them. But for this one, I did use it straight out of the tube, and that was just a golden carbon black. And I just made a watercolor wash. So I'm going to show you how to do that right now. And I'm using a really fancy palette. You can see I always use Tupperware lids because I had lots of them. And I like to keep my costs down in the studio as much as possible. You only need a tiny drop of paint and a little bit of water. Actually, a lot of water and a tiny bit of paint to color your board. And if it's too much, you can always just dab it off. And then you just let this dry. So it gives a real faint look, but you can still see some of the writing underneath, and there's this wonderful, wonderful texture to the paper. So we're going to let that dry, and we're coming back to do the next step. So in this step, right after you have it painted, the next step is to use colored pencils. And since I'm creating another sunflower book, I'm going to just color back in a little bit where I think that the flower might be in the center. And I'm going to kind of color the sides where the foliage probably would be. And when you look at my sunflower book, you can see that I chose a very light kind of turquoise color for the outside edge. So I just thought I would use the yellow because I thought that would be really pretty and it would stand out so you could see what I was doing. Now the cool thing about Prismacolors, and these are Prismacolor pencils, is that they're water soluble, if you didn't know that. It's one of those things you find out, you know, in the studio where you think, I wonder if this will work. I'm just going to give this a light coat, wash it just slightly, and you can see how nice that the Prismacolors look. Kind of muted, almost like a watercolor, but just a really different look. You can definitely see that there are strokes in there. Tissue paper and parchment paper are two of the things I've been using in the studio to create that kind of see-through look. Tracing paper works well too. And some of the new parchment paper really has a difficulty when it comes to adhering to surfaces. So I try to look for really old parchment paper. But tissue paper seems to have a matte side and a shiny side. And I drew all of the images by hand on the dull side. And tissue paper is, as you know, very, very tender, we'll say that, and delicate. And so you have to have a very light touch when you are drawing on tissue paper. I drew all the images by hand, but since you're using tissue paper, you can just trace it and pen it out, you know, so that would be the easiest thing to do. I would probably go, I've just drawn this rough sunflower in here for you, and I would probably go in and do a little bit more drawing on here just to give it a little bit more definition. And I am using a Sharpie fine tip pen, and it is a permanent marker, so you don't have to worry about it. As soon as it's dry, then you can just glue it down, and that's what we're going to do next. So my image is drawn and it's dried, and this would be my cover. I'm going to pretend this is my cover, and I am going to glue this down. So I'm going to get my brush and my gel medium, and you want the brush to be as dry as possible. In fact, if you don't put it in water at first, that would be perfect, because tissue paper is so delicate that if you use too much water, you're just going to have a mess on your hands. It's just going to fall apart on you. So, and then I'm just going to lay it down, and I'm positioning it where I want the most yellow to be, or any other color that you might want. And then I'm going to lightly pat it down, because if you push it and it's wet, it will just jump right off the paper. So you don't want that to happen. Now, majority of the image is down there, and I'm going to pull back, and I'm going to just lightly dab and then lay it back down. Now, I would normally wait for this to dry, but we don't have that kind of time. So what I'm going to tell you is then I would go back and I would tear parts of it so that the original book shows through. And that's what I did with the other one. If that means you tear off part of a petal or the stem, then so be it. It's art. You know, you don't have to worry about that. You want something that's going to evoke the spirit of the garden. You don't want the garden, or you would have taken a photo. So that would be our cover. And then we would just simply gel over the top and allow that to dry. So there you go. So that would be the cover of it. Well, I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed the little books. And if you have any questions at all about the products or any of the steps, feel free to leave a comment for me on YouTube, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. So next week, I'm going to take you on a tour of my studio. It's a little tiny studio, but we had a lot of work done here, and I can't wait to show you everything that's in here. So I hope you'll tune in then, and I'll see you later.